Now, I don't know about you, but I'm in the mood to keep talking about the market revolution. But this time, let's focus on how this development affected US society and culture during this period. It sounds real tasty to me, so if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, so I reckon I should start by telling you that one of the chief effects of the market revolution was the growth of cities, which is a phenomenon we call urbanization. And for the most part, city growth occurred in the north in places like New York and Philadelphia. But all cities that were growing were geographically situated among major trade routes, some of which were located in the west. For example, Cincinnati, Ohio became a major trade city owing to its location on the Ohio River, and Rochester, New York grew rapidly on account of its strategic position on the Erie Canal. So the point you need to remember is this: the cities that were located along busy trade routes grew rapidly during this period as new infrastructure united the various regions of the United States. And I should mention that even though, yes, we're geeking out about the rapid pace of urbanization during this period, the United States was still primarily rural and would be until about the 20th century. But to add a further complication, rural people were becoming more connected to cities thanks to all the transportation networks that sent agricultural goods to cities and then manufactured goods to rural areas. Oh, and by the way, if you want Noteguides to follow along with this video and all my videos, check that link in the description. Okay, now trade routes and strategic geography were not the only reason cities were growing during this period. No, another major contributor to urbanization was immigration. Between the 1820s and 1840s, more than 2 million European immigrants arrived to the United States, the bulk of which were Irish, German, or Scandinavian. And why, says you, did those millions of immigrants relocate their hind parts to America? Well, says I, many of the Irish, who were at first mostly Protestant and then later mostly Catholic, came because of widespread hunger on account of the Irish potato famine, which was worsened by oppressive economic policies enacted by the British. And then many Germans also came because of lack of food due to poor harvest and failed political revolutions, which left many of them feeling marginalized. And the German immigrants were mostly Lutherans, but there was also a strong minority of Catholics and Jews as well. And look, I'm not just flapping my mouth whole about early 19th century immigration statistics for funsies, although I'm sure we can all agree this is real fun. No, there are two big points to remember here. First, a large portion of these immigrants, especially the Irish, settled in big cities in the north where they could find work in America's growing industrial sector. And in doing so, not only did these cities grow, but they also became more ethnically and religiously diverse. And side note, many of the German immigrants migrated further west to work on farms, and while that did diversify the frontier, the impact wasn't as significant as the diversification of cities. Second, this spike in immigration was intimately connected to the market revolution, since those who settled in northern cities, especially the Irish, provided an influx of cheap labor for factories, which then powered the market revolution. Okay, now the second major social consequence of the market revolution was the development of a more defined social hierarchy. In other words, it became increasingly clear who was on the top and who was on the bottom. But before I tell you about those new social stratifications, let me tell you why they emerged, because it might not be exactly obvious to you why a big economic change would result in a reordering of society. Okay, so remember from the previous video that prior to the market revolution, most people fed and clothed themselves through subsistence farming, or at least semi-subsistence farming. And that means that most people grew what they needed to eat and made what they needed to live with their own hands. You want a new shirt? Then thread that needle, baby. You want a sandwich? Well, I hope you're willing to wait about 6 months for the harvest to come in, because there ain't no Publix down the road. But during and after the market revolution, most goods, both industrial and agricultural, were made for other people to buy and sell on distant markets. So that meant that a growing number of Americans were working for wages and therefore bought most of the food and clothes that they needed to survive. And the name for this wage working group was the working class, and they occupied the bottom rung of the social ladder. And this was by far the largest class and made up the bulk of urban Americans who worked in factories for pitifully low wages, which is why they were sometimes referred to as wage slaves. But don't worry, they also endured pretty bleak working conditions too, so, you know, it was worth the low wages. Anyway, many folks in the working class were immigrants, but a significant number of them were also young women, and let me tell you a little bit about both groups. So working class urban immigrants, many of whom were Irish, worked in low-wage industrial jobs that Americans themselves were unwilling to take. And while that had many positive economic benefits that facilitated the market revolution, the sheer number of Irish immigrants simultaneously led to a growing nativist backlash. Now, by definition, nativism describes the movement to protect the interests of the native-born people against the influence of foreign immigrants. And so with all these Irish immigrants flooding the cities with their Irish Catholic cooties, American nativists were concerned that such cooties were threatening American Protestantism. And so nativists be nativists, and they led efforts to contain the Catholic contagion. For example, on a couple of occasions, nativists attacked Catholic convents because, you know, if you can't even beat up a meek Catholic nun, then are you even a man? And maybe the most visible nativist move was the creation of a powerful anti-Catholic political party known as the Know Nothing Party. Okay, also the working class was made up of a significant number of young working women. In fact, in the late 1820s, several entire towns devoted to manufacturing were constructed in New England, the most famous of which was located in Lowell, Massachusetts. And so the sponsors of this town recruited young farm girls from the countryside to work in their factories and live in their towns. And for those girls who agreed to go, their lives were managed by a strict code. So church attendance was required, curfews had to be observed, involved in their work was precisely regulated by clocks in order to ensure productivity. I mean, it's every young girl's dream, right? Anyway, in the beginning, many of these girls felt satisfied in their work and thought about the journey away from home as something of an adventure. However, by the 1830s, their working conditions deteriorated as factory owners cut wages and the factory town boarding houses became entirely overcrowded. In response, the Lowell girls and many other women who worked in similarly constructed industrial towns began to agitate for reform. And after several strikes and protests, working women joined together in the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association, which was the first women's labor union in the United States. And their most vocal and widespread effort was to advocate for a 10-hour workday instead of a 12-hour workday. And their success was at best mixed, especially since women had no right to vote, but even so, the pressure they exerted on the Massachusetts legislature was immense. Okay, now let's move on to the other groups. Now, because the market revolution and industrialization fundamentally changed the nature of how people worked and how people interacted with the economy, a new social phenomenon emerged, namely the rise of the middle class. And if that doesn't sound familiar, then let me explain it up for you. So, the market revolution essentially divided American society into three distinct tiers. On the top was the business elite, which represented the smallest class, but also the wealthiest and most powerful. And in general, these were the owners of factories or shipping companies or some other like businesses that fit into the essential structure of the market revolution. And then you had the middle class, which was a brand spanking new social designation that emerged as a direct result of industrialization. Now, the middle class was composed of those folks who were not as wealthy as the business elite, but wealthier than the working class. And essentially, middle class work was intangible work. In other words, middle class folks didn't make or produce anything that you could see or touch. So the middle class was filled with lawyers and teachers and doctors, to name only a few, which is to say they did not get their hands dirty. Today, it's what we'd call knowledge work, like work done with the thinky parts and not the grippy parts. And so on the whole, the middle class acted as managers of the working class. And as this distinct class began to emerge, they developed their own set of values, including robust education for their children, religious affiliation, and sobriety. And they also developed a unique concept of gender roles and family structure, and that's going to lead us right into the next point. Okay, so finally, let's talk about the significant shift in conceptions of gender roles and family structures that grew out of the market revolution, and this was mainly a phenomenon that occurred in the middle class. Now, one of the chief values of the middle class, especially the upper middle class, was that men should earn enough money to support the entire family. And that, of course, means that middle class women should not have to work. And as a result of this shift, two distinct social phenomena became prevalent. First, middle class men and women were increasingly understood to have separate spheres of existence and responsibility. So the male sphere was defined by work outside the home, and the female sphere was defined by domestic work inside the home. So if you were in the middle class, you abided by this motto: men work, women make the sandwiches, just as God intended. And to middle class men, this arrangement was basically the definition of liberty and independence. And then to take it even further, their homes were divided by gender-coded spaces. For example, the study belonged to the man and his male companions, while the kitchen was the domain of the women folk. Now, just to be absolutely clear, this was a middle-class phenomenon. This kind of gender separation was not present in the working class, since both men and women had to work in order to make ends meet. Anyway, the second and related social phenomenon that emerged in the middle class was the rise of the cult of domesticity. You see, as the division between women and men became increasingly clear, the middle-class ladies grew a question mark over their heads and started to wonder, okay, so how do I woman? And thankfully, they didn't have to wonder for very long, because as this social trend gathered steam, a flurry of publications emerged, including books and novels and magazines, which sought to define this new role in which women found themselves. It became known as the cult of domesticity, and under its influence, middle-class women learned that they were to fulfill their social role by raising virtuous children and providing their husbands with a home kept to exacting standards. Additionally, middle-class women fulfilled their role as purchasers and shoppers in the emerging consumer economy. And in many ways, this was merely an extension of the ideal of the Republican motherhood that gained traction after the Revolutionary period. And although this idea of female submission and subordination would become widespread in American society, by the end of this period, we're going to see a growing movement to challenge it. But alas, I get ahead of myself, so we'll save that for another video. Okay, you can click here to watch my other videos from Unit 4, or you can click here to grab my video note guides, which will help you get all the contents of this course firmly crammed into your brain fold. I'm glad you came around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.